Ralph Goff, welcome back to the World Deciphered, powered by the Cipher Brief. You're joining us from Vilnius in Lithuania, where you've been for the past several days. It's nice to have you back.
Hi, Suzanne. It's great to be back.
You know, there's a lot going on in the region where you are right now. Things are not going so well in Georgia when it comes to Russian influence there. What's the sentiment in Lithuania, Ralph? I know that you have been covering this particular issue quite closely. Are they concerned about what's happening in Georgia and the broader threat of Russian influence?
Suzanne, yes, absolutely. Look, Lithuania, during the Soviet era, you had the three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and they were very different from the rest of the Soviet Union. I remember coming here in the late 80s, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, in the early part of my career, and there was a completely different vibe here, right? It was Soviet, but it wasn't. And the people here were different, and then you looked at like the maps, all the official maps in the United States, they all said that they had a little asterisk next to the Baltic republics that said, the U.S. government has never recognized the annexation of the Baltic states by the Soviet Union, right? And yeah, okay, that was nice to say, but then there was nothing behind it. And so now Lithuania is looking at what's happening in Georgia, they're looking at what's happening in Ukraine, they're looking at what's happened in Moldova, Romania, and they're wondering, okay, so if these countries fall, are they going to be another asterisk on the map in the United States, right? We don't recognize their annexation, but nothing we can do about it. So yes, there's great concern here about events in all those countries.
Mm-hmm. And particularly also, Ukraine, Lithuania has been very involved in trying to help gather intelligence, support Ukraine in their effort. How would you describe the nature of that intelligence relationship these days? We're now approaching almost 3 years since Russia invaded Ukraine. It's hard to believe.
So look, the Baltic states, all three of them, Lithuania is a country of about 3 million people, right? Just under 3 million people, 2.9, something like that. They have met their spending requirements for NATO. They spend like 2.5%. They're aiming for 3%, 4%, and the government's even talking about shooting for 5%. And by the way, a new government was named like 2 days ago. So there's a lot of flux here in Lithuania, but the one content has been support, not just for NATO, but support for Ukraine. Here, one of the things I noticed on the buses for mass transit, on the front, you have the electric sign that says where the bus is going, and it flips over, and it alternates with Vilnius loves Ukraine, right? And I tell you, I've seen as many flags, Ukrainian flags around the city here as I've seen in Kiev, right? So there's a great amount of sympathy for Ukraine, and not just because it's another victim of Russian oppression, and the Baltics fear that, but also because the lessons of history, and they look back and they remember that asterisk on the maps from the United States. So this is a country that is very very sensitive to what's happening next door, and being a frontline state, this country, not only have they met the expense requirements of NATO, and they got President Trump's approval. They've already reached out to the President-elect Trump's government, and he's kind of like said, "Oh yeah, you guys are okay. You've met the GDP expenditure requirements." But they're trying to go beyond that, and they've also literally stripped their military warehouses to send everything they can to the front in Ukraine, and I think they're somewhat frustrated by the fact that they're a small country, they're leading the way. Where's the rest of Europe?
Yep. I think that's an aspect that's often overlooked in the headlines, particularly the headlines emanating from the United States and Western press, Ralph, is just how much Lithuania has given to support the war in Ukraine. I'm glad you brought up the Trump administration, because I want to ask you what the sentiment is there. They've been partners with the U.S. through one Trump administration. What are they expecting, or what are they hoping for from the next one?
Yeah, that's a great question. And naturally, that was like, after how are you doing? That was usually the second question. So what do we expect from these guys? I give the Lithuanians credit. They're approaching this with an open mind. I know from the people I've talked to that for months before the election even, they were reaching out to people in Trump's circle to try and get a feel for where this was headed. And now you have the visit in the United States. Andrei Yermak, Ukrainian President Zelensky's close advisor, was in the States this week. And Ukrainians are following that all closely. But I also give them credit for having an open mind. No one here has hit the panic button, right? They look at President Trump and they agreed with his criticism of NATO. They agreed with his criticism of countries like Germany who weren't meeting the expenditure requirements, right? So they're very pragmatic. And basically their only question is, okay, we have a new administration, a new approach. Let's see where this goes, right? And not once have I heard anyone here complain or say that, what's wrong with America or what's wrong with this. They've been very pragmatic in their approach, very open-minded.
I think it would be fair to say that if there's confusion about what the next Trump administration might bring, it all kind of boils down to that relationship between Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. I have to ask you, if the President-elect Trump does make good on his promise and bring about a negotiated settlement to the war in Ukraine,
Right.
what would Vilnius most want to see included in any kind of agreement so that they know they have future protections?
Right. So, along with this pragmatism that they look at with a new administration, their expectations are actually kind of low, right? They're critical of the Zelensky government. They're critical of events in Ukraine, right? But at the same time, they look at it from the viewpoint of, okay, what's next? If Ukraine falls, right, are we next? And there's a lot of people in the West who say, no, this is just panic mongering. This is just, irrational fears. But, when you spent 70 years as an asterisk on the maps of the, United States, I think you've earned the right to have a little bit of skepticism, right? And so, this is a country that in World War II was squeezed between Nazi Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union. And so, they've learned that you can't just take things at face value. You've got to have not just, diplomatic agreements or like the Budapest Agreement that the Ukrainians are so fond of complaining about, but you've got to have real guarantees. And they're realists. They understand that maybe Ukraine membership in NATO is a tough ask, and maybe not in the cards now. But they are absolutely interested in seeing some kind of strategic security architecture that protects Ukraine from a renewed Russian assault if there is some sort of peace agreement. Because
Right.
they look at themselves as next on the menu, right?
Exactly.
One thing I've heard from all sides here is like, hey, if Ukraine falls, and Putin is emboldened, it's not just some kind of cliche metaphor that he's going to turn his attention to the Baltics. They look at his past announcements, his past speeches, where he's claimed that Ukraine isn't a real country, it's really part of Russia. He's said the same thing about the Baltic states.
Ralph, I want to ask you, given what's happening right now in Georgia, given the fact that Russia actually invaded Georgia several years ago, which people forget about, and they still have
Yeah.
troops there, given what's
Yeah.
happening in Ukraine, given concerns in Bulgaria about the onslaught of Russian influence there, just could you kind of give us a quick assessment, in your opinion, about the level of Russian sort of misinformation, disinformation, influence, gray zone tactics, just kind of level set us on Russia's involvement in Lithuania right now?
So, the Georgia question is interesting. I mean, there you have a situation where you have a government that's headed by, a Georgian oligarch who's basically in Putin's pocket, and he's effectively bought the media. He's paid off enough supporters in the government apparatus to put his own people in there, right? And the Lithuanians are looking at that and saying, like, okay, if a worst case scenario can happen in a country like that, what happens to us if we're left defenseless, right? Will we be at the mercy of some oligarch who decides, to cash in with Vladimir Putin? And the shame of Georgia is that this is a country that, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, went through years of deprivation and civil war and economic collapse. I spent a lot of time there in the mid 1990s, and it was this is a place where people the Georgian people were very culturally proud, very highly educated. I mean, they had their own language and alphabet that they kept alive for 70 years of Soviet occupation, right? And in the end, they were burning their books and chopping up their pianos for firewood to keep their apartments warm, right? And so that's a worst case scenario. And the Lithuanians, they look at Georgia, they look at the potential fall of Moldova, they look at the lack of adequate response, in their opinion, from NATO, and they're wondering, like, well, who's next?
Exactly. I think that's a fair thing to say throughout the region. Last question for you, Ralph in Vilnius. I think it's
Sure.
important once in a while, too, to take a step back and remind people why this matters. Why does it matter specifically to the United States and maybe even to Europe if Russia sort of takes over that region in terms of influence, at least,
Yeah.
and maybe physically, like it's trying to do in
Yeah.
Ukraine? Why does it matter?
That's a great question, and frankly, it's one that to be critical. The outgoing Biden administration has failed to make that argument to the American people, right? And the Trump administration remains to be seen if they will be persuaded to make that argument to the American people, because they're still weighing where they want to go on this, right? I mean, the Lithuanians asked me, where's Trump going to go on this? I said, I don't even think they know yet, right? But for me, I look at the war in Ukraine, I look at the political unrest in Georgia, I look at the political turmoil in Romania, you look at the unrest in the Middle East, right? The conflict between Iran and Israel, it's all linked. And what we're looking at here is these aren't just conflicts of nation states, these are conflicts of values, right? When you look at Russia, who's on their side? I mean, it's Russia, North Korea, Iran, and with China lurking in the background, right? I mean, that should tell people all they need to know about who's on what side. I mean, you know, think about going to that dinner party with those guys, right? I mean, this is not just one state against another. This is a battle of cultural values.
I don't think you and I are going to get that dinner invite, Ralph, and that's probably just fine. Ralph Goff joining us live from Vilnius, Lithuania. I really want to thank you for taking the time to give us a sense of what you've seen and heard there on the ground. It's always nice to see you, Ralph. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure, Suzanne. Thanks for having me on. And I just want to say that in spite of the festive background behind me, you know, the mood is a little bit gloomier here given recent events in the region. So
Yeah, it is nice to see some of the lights and the festivities, though, in hopes that people do still have glimmers of hope and reasons to celebrate, especially at the holidays. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you, Suzanne.